Hello, everyone. My name is Rutvij Bhatt, but most people in America call me Ru. And I'm here to welcome you to our second leadership convo, and I'm a board member here at Act to Change. Oh, Elaine, you're on mute.
Hi, everyone. My name's Elaine Dang. I'm from Oakland, California, and I'm also a board member at Act to Change.
So we're really excited to welcome you here to our second leadership convo brought to you by Act to Change and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Last month, our co-board members, Jamie Locke and Mindy Kordash-Shim, put together a panel that featured our co-founder, Malik Pancholi, with Ryan Alexander Holmes and 4 youth leaders of different generations from around the country to discuss racism and anti-Blackness within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and how to talk to their parents and grandparents about it. They talked about the role of AAPI youth today and how it's important to be loud, appreciate our differences, shine in our own unique ways, and become advocates against racism within our own communities. Today, Elaine and I are continuing that conversation, but from a different perspective. AAPI parents and caregivers are in a very unique position to help combat anti-Blackness within our communities, and it's important that we give our youth the tools to stand in solidarity with all marginalized communities.
Thanks, Ru. We also want to take some time today to recognize what's been happening in New York, in the Bay Area, where I am, and all over the country. Xenophobia and hatred against the Asian community is not new. But just because it isn't new doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Since the COVID-19 pandemic started, hate crimes against Asian Americans have skyrocketed, significantly contributed by anti-Asian rhetoric from our own country's leaders. We are grateful for the many voices that have risen to support our community. And we call on everyone, especially those with a platform, to amplify efforts of local groups. Grassroots and community-based organizations have been working for a long time supporting their communities, and they know most about their unique needs. We encourage everyone to invest in resources in them and to promote community-based, culturally relevant, and trauma-informed solutions that do not rely on over-policing. Some examples of great organizations that we are following are the Oakland Chinatown Coalition, CAV, Organizing Asian Communities in New York City, and Asians Advancing Justice, or Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Thanks so much, Elaine. We encourage everyone to use the hashtag #StopAAPIHate to bring awareness to these attacks, but please keep those aforementioned principles in mind with your posts. Now, before we delve into the conversation, we'd actually like to share an important message from a prominent civil rights leader, Wade Henderson, in his capacity representing our co-sponsor, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Hello, I'm Wade Henderson, the interim president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference is a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. Founded in 1950, the Leadership Conference has coordinated national advocacy efforts on behalf of every major civil rights law since 1957. As the president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, who led the organization for over 20 years, I know that the real power of our coalition comes from leaders, advocates, and artists like the people you are going to hear from today. It comes from you and your children. It is all of us coming together across different communities from different backgrounds to demand justice and fight back against white supremacy in all aspects of our lives. And as someone who has led national and international campaigns for civil and human rights, I never lost sight of the fact that change starts with us and our families. That is why I was particularly happy to be a part of this conversation today about teaching our kids to combat anti-Blackness and all forms of racism. The fact that we are having this conversation today about combating anti-Blackness and other forms of racism in the midst of a horrifying increase in hate incidents and hate crimes targeting the AAPI community demonstrates the power of people and coalition. My heart and mind have been with the AAPI community, especially in recent weeks, as we have seen the vile attacks on Asian American elders. To be clear, we know these attacks are not new, nor is the white supremacy that fuels these attacks new, but our determination to fight back together must be renewed again and again. That is why we have been so proud to partner with Act to Change through our Black Justice is Our Justice campaign. You can learn more about the campaign with Act to Change at blackjusticeisourjustice.org. Black Justice is Our Justice is a national campaign that undermines tactics white supremacists use to divide diverse immigrant communities and others targeted for hate. We see the ways white supremacists use fear to sow division between communities of color, Black communities, religious minorities, immigrants, and other historically excluded groups. Our campaign highlights stories and promotes acts of real and meaningful solidarity and unity among diverse immigrant groups and other communities targeted for hate. We highlight Asian American community leaders and others fighting white supremacy while providing practical tools to bridge divides and fight back. It is in that spirit that I welcome everyone to this important conversation and express gratitude to all of you for investing the time, energy, and resources in combating anti-Blackness. We are here together today in defiance of white supremacist attempts to divide us and in celebration of our collective power. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Wade. Your insight and leadership is invaluable, and we are so grateful for your hard work. So today, we've curated a panel with activists and artists that will share their experiences as Asian American parents. The activists will lay the groundwork on anti-racist parenting and why anti-Blackness has no place in our community. Then we will bring on artists to join our activists to discuss their lived experiences raising AAPI kids and how they recognize Black History Month. We hope to give you some tools to talk to your children about this topic. So first up is Dr. Sujin Pate, an educator, writer, and DEI consultant dedicated to centering the lives and experiences of historically marginalized people. She has taught courses on critical race theory, women of color feminism, African diasporic literature, and US history and culture. Hi, Sujin. How are you today?
Oh, great. I'm so happy and honored to be here with you, Rue, and the rest of the panelists who will be coming as well.
We are so excited to have you. Thank you. Also joining us today is Deepa Iyer, a South Asian American writer, strategist, lawyer, and racial justice advocate, and director of Solidarity Is at the Building Movement Project. Hi, Deepa. How are you today?
Hi, Rue. Hi, Sujin.
All right. So, Sujin, I'm going to start with you. We've reached a point in our history that most of the Asian American population is now foreign born. And it's far too common that more recent Asian immigrants don't have the opportunity to learn about the longstanding history of Black Americans and Asian Americans. Can you tell us a little bit about how Black history has shaped Asian American history and why that's important?
Sure. Where do I even begin? First of all, you're absolutely right that history isn't taught in schools. You have to go to a college or a university that has an Asian American Studies program or department to get that kind of education. But back to your question, as a discipline, Asian American Studies came directly out of the social movements of the 1950s and 60s, which were spearheaded by Black people. So the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, these were all led by Black people, and in particular Black women, even though Black men ended up being the figureheads of these movements. So it was Black women who were behind the scenes creating the infrastructure that drove these movements. And in this way, the entire field of ethnic studies, Chicano studies, American Indian studies, Asian American studies, and of course, African American studies, owes its existence to Black people because they worked to mobilize multiracial coalitions in the fight for justice and equality that led to the rise of ethnic studies in the late 1960s. As it relates to my own personal history, I came to understand my identity as an Asian American through African American studies. In the schools that I attended, only white history was taught. So it wasn't until I went to college that I read books that were actually written by people of color. And during my senior year of college, the first ever course on African American literature was offered there. And it was a course on the Harlem Renaissance. And in reading the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, Jean Toomer, and Langston Hughes, I read literature for the first time in my life that reflected how I felt and how I saw and experienced the world. And that's saying a lot because I was an English major, so I had read a lot of books. And I didn't realize how starved I was for that literature, for literature that reflected me, until I got a taste of it. And once I got a taste, I was hungry for more. So instead of becoming a high school English teacher like I planned, I went to Howard and majored in African American literature. And it was at Howard University that I saw how clearly and directly connected Black history and Asian American history was in terms of colonization and how our oppression was justified through US imperial interests. And while the ways in which racism plays out in our communities are both similar and different, we have all been, at one time or another, been used as scapegoats for the social ills in our country. So for me, Black history very literally became the vehicle that helped me learn about my own personal history, as well as Asian American history in general. And for that, I will always be grateful to the liberatory education that I received at Howard.
Thank you so much, Sujan. And you know what? I'll be honest. I actually didn't learn much of this history until I went to law school.
Yeah.
And that's something, an opportunity most people don't have. There was a great documentary on it on PBS, Asians in America, I think it's called. It is available for rent on Amazon right now. So I highly recommend, if you have time, to view it, because they do connect the communities together. And it'll give you a good starter on the history, so to speak. Deepa, I want to turn to you. Can you share the reasons that wedges occur between Black and Asian communities, and how are people dismantling those?
Yes, absolutely. And I think Sujan really laid the groundwork for us to understand this even. So I think to get a sense of why wedges occur, we have to do a little bit of stepping back and look at the system as a whole. And I think a visual might be helpful to think about it. So if we think about the system of white supremacy, it wants to stay in power, right? And if you can picture a ladder of racial hierarchy where whiteness is on the top rung, this enables white people and whiteness to stay in power, whether that's politics or academia, any sector really in this country, right? And at the bottom of the ladder is white supremacist beliefs and dominant historical narratives that are about anti-Blackness, right? So you've got the ladder of with whiteness on the top and anti-Blackness at the bottom. And then other communities of color kind of fall on the rungs between whiteness and anti-Blackness. So when we think about that, we understand that white supremacy really wants that structure to be upheld. And one of the ways to do that is to pit communities against each other, right? Divide and conquer. And so if everyone's fighting each other, they're not fighting the system as a whole. And how does that show up? It shows up in different ways, right? So in many ways, we might be integrating anti-Black attitudes and perceptions that white supremacy has already set up. The author Toni Morrison famously said that the move into mainstream America always means buying into the notion of American Blacks as the real aliens. blackness. Right. And that's a profound statement. It basically means that we're buying into and internalizing a lot of anti-Black viewpoints in order to set ourselves up against Black people on that ladder. So it can happen through colorism. It can happen through biases that Black people are inherently going to break the law, or that they aren't working hard enough. And so you can see how easy it is then to buy into that model minority myth, which posits Asian Americans as better than, in quotes, Black and Latinx communities. So that's why these wedges show up, right? So how do we dismantle them? Well, we have to really take on the responsibility of dismantling that entire structure of white supremacy. We have to recognize that this ladder exists, right? And that in order to break it and dismantle it altogether, one of the things we have to do is really fight against anti-Blackness. And so that's what Black liberatory activists mean when they say when Black people are free, everyone will be free. Because when Black people will be free, that ladder will no longer cease to exist at all, right? So, so I think that, what we need to do is think about not climbing that ladder towards whiteness. We need to think about chipping away at it. And I'll provide some more ideas later, but, really quickly, I think there are many examples when Black and Asian people have worked in solidarity, and Asian Americans have been chipping away at that ladder. Sujin talked about one of the most powerful ones with the Black Power movement and ethnic studies programs. More recently, folks might remember that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, that a South Asian restaurant kept its doors open and acted as a triage station for those who were injured during the uprisings, right? There are many examples like these where people are chipping away at the ladder. And currently where folks in the Bay Area are talking about community-based solutions rather than increased policing in their neighborhoods is another example of fighting the system than fighting each other.
Thank you so much. That's really inspiring to see the community standing up for each other. And I definitely have seen some of that, but we should promote that as much as we can, because that's the message and the rhetoric we want to have out there, as opposed to what is really being reported in the media, I think. Sujin, so you're Korean American and you're raising a mixed Black daughter, right?
Yeah.
You also run a podcast called Anti-Racist Parenting. Now, can you tell me a little bit about the anti-Blackness you saw in your own community and what led to the genesis of your podcast?
Sure, yeah. So anti-Blackness is certainly rampant in the Korean American community. When I first showed my family a picture of the man that I was dating, who is now the father of my daughter, my relatives back in South Korea immediately told me to break up with him. And why was that? Because he's Black. And the reason for this was because, like the majority of white Americans, they only knew about Black people through what they saw on TV and Hollywood movies. Mm-hmm. So US racism is exported around the world through Hollywood movies. So my family in Korea was learning to be anti-Black through mass media, just like the rest of us, that are taught here. But they were also learning something else through these movies. We're learning to be pro-white, not just anti-Black, but to be pro-white. And that desire to be white, not only in terms of appearance through the use of skin lightening products and eyelid surgeries, but also in terms of culture and proximity to whiteness. So what Deepa was talking about, kind of, us trying to climb that ladder of white supremacy is rampant in the Korean American community. When our daughters were toddlers, my friend was sharing how she wants her child to learn the classics, read white male literature, and play classical music, read white male music, and study classical art like ballet, because in her words, it's quote unquote the best. And my friend who teaches in Korea at an international school shared that she's the only person of color teaching there. The rest of the people are white. Why? Because Koreans prefer white people to teach their kids, even in Korea. And because because they think that white people are considered to be the best and they're the smartest. So I share this because this is where anti-Blackness comes from. It's rooted in white supremacy. Again, going back to the ladder that Deepa was sharing. Anti-Blackness is a pillar of white supremacy. And as long as the Korean American community valorizes and deems whiteness as the best, anti-Blackness will never go away. In regards to the podcast, so about a year ago, my white friend Hannah and I were talking about anti-racism, both in the context of work and parenting. And she mentioned that we should start a podcast to talk about these issues. Then George Floyd was publicly lynched for all of us to see, sending shockwaves across the world. And we knew then that now was the time for that podcast. So we started with a 3-part series on how to talk to your children about the uprising that was taking place this summer, beginning with elementary age children and moving all the way up to high school, and published our first episode in August. And we've been going strong ever since.
That's really exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I obviously have encountered a bit of anti-Blackness in my family as well. And it wasn't until talking about George Floyd, really, that I was able to be able to address it specifically with them, right? But what was really interesting is the opportunity to hear them grow. Things that they said when I was a kid, as opposed to now. Like my father said that weekend, he's like, "You're right. We owe so much to the Black community." And I started crying when he said that, because it was so inspiring to hear him kind of evolve from the thoughts that he had from when he first came to this country. So
yeah, and your father is proof that it doesn't matter, like even being elderly, right? A lot of people say that you can't change, your stripes or whatever, teach a dog new tricks. And here is proof positive that you absolutely can change. So that's why having conversations like this, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable you think they are, is so important to have.
Yes, exactly. Deepa, I know you touched on this a little bit before, but what are some other solidarity values and practices that might be helpful for Asian American parents?
Yes. So I would say that when we think about solidarity practice, it's a lot harder to practice it and a lot easier to hashtag it, right? And so it's really important to think about, what do the values mean? And so 2 I'll just quickly talk about are centering and co-liberation. Co-liberation is this belief that our freedom is connected to that of others, right? And we're in this together because we see the commonalities more than the differences. That's not to say that everyone is going through the same types of injustice and we don't want to flatten it, but we see that we are fighting the system. We're fighting that ladder, right? So a second one is centering, when we're centering the experiences of those who have been historically and systematically marginalized and silenced. So those are just 2 principles. How does that work in practice, right? As we are talking about confronting anti-Blackness as Asian American parents. So one example is that we can take opportunities to center Black experience everywhere that it is marginalized. So let's take education, for example, right? We often see that Black authors are rarely read other than during Black History Month. So we can take opportunities with our kids to actually find books that center Black protagonists. I recommend a trilogy from Rita Williams Garcia of the Gaither Sisters and Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming. Those are books that I've been reading aloud with my son, and it has opened up a lot of conversations about the Black Power movement and so on and so forth. A second way is to just use what's around us to talk about this, what is happening, right? So I live in an area, and I'm sure many people who are watching might too, where almost every other home has a Black Lives Matter sign in its yard, right? Or there are churches and places of worship that have those signs. And so one day on one of our walks, my son Ahi asked why a sign like that had to even be made and put out publicly. That opened up a conversation about why Black lives have not mattered in this country and what could happen when they do. And it also enabled us to talk about how, as Asian Americans, we're able to get access to basic rights because of the Black civil rights struggle, and that we're indebted to that struggle. So those are just a couple of examples. And before I close, I'll quickly say that oftentimes when we talk about confronting anti-Blackness, there's also this tendency to erase our own experiences as Asian Americans. And I want to say, really clearly that we can do both. we can, of course, address anti-Black racism, and we can also acknowledge and validate the struggles that Asian Americans face. There is room and time for both of that, and I think we should lift both of them up.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's right. You know, especially right now with everything that's going on, and a lot of Asian Americans are feeling that with the attacks, it's not getting as much attention, maybe, you know, as what happened to George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. There is room for both. And in fact, they don't negate each other. So thank you so much. I do also wonder how much different my world would be if I was taught all these things very early on. So I'm really grateful for having this conversation today, and enabling our audience to have these conversations with their kids early on. So now I'd like to actually shift a little bit and introduce the remaining members of our panel. First, I'd like to welcome Melissa Beck to the conversation. Melissa is a comedian, a podcaster, and a writer. Melissa got national recognition as one of the first biracial Asian and Black public figures in the early 2000s. Hi, Melissa.
Well, hi, Ruth. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I also would like to introduce another Deepa, Deepa Purohit and Sanjit De Silva, two New York-based artists that use their work to bring stories of people of color to the stage and film, and who happen to be part of my family.
Hi, everyone.
So excited to have you on board. And I just have to say, I'm excited to have two Deepas on a panel, just because when does that ever happen in America? So hi to everyone. Thanks again. Melissa, I'd like to start with you. Now, you're Black and Filipino, and you grew up in a biracial home. So what messages did you receive about race and white supremacy in America? And what impact did that have on you, especially when you were thrust into the public spotlight all of a sudden in the early 2000s?
You know, it's interesting because I think people assume that biracial children are born with a innate knowledge that they're special and they're different, but we actually do, you know, get taught that by the outside world outside of our house. So my early years were spent in the Philippines and in North Dakota because my father was in the Air Force, so we moved around a lot. So a lot of my youth was spent on military bases where everybody felt like they were mixed race. So there was no reason for me to feel, you know, special or different. It wasn't until my dad was about to retire and he retired in Florida, where we then moved into, you know, with upward mobility, into a predominantly white neighborhood. And one of my earliest memories was my dad, full uniform, dropping me off at my second grade class. And my dad is my Black parent. And knowing and feeling everybody whispering about who this uniformed man was that was dropping me off. Because if you look at me, no one ever assumes that I'm Black or thinks that I'm Black. So it was the first time in my life that an intense like otherness like washed over my whole body, because I never felt different. And I literally heard people whispering, you know, the other, is that her dad? Who's that guy? Is that her dad? And so then throughout the day, people would ask me, are you Black? And no one had ever asked, why would anybody ask me that? I'm a child. So I remember going home and being like, wait a second, guys, there's something going on here. Are we Black or something? Which, you know, came off as a funny question to my parents, because why would their child be asking them this? I've been their child for this long and it's never come up. But these weren't conversations that we were having in our household, because these weren't questions that I had as a child. So that was when it started. And I think that it's important to explain that, you know, when we think about biracial children and, you know, this idea, like what Sujin was talking about, this Hollywood perception that we're going to be tragic characters because we don't know where we fit in, that is kind of thrust upon us. We didn't feel like we didn't fit in until you told us that. So it's a lot of those messages that you kind of have to unlearn through discovery on your own, but also through asking questions. But also keep in mind, my mother, the Filipino parent, just like also I was backstage when Sujin was talking about how, you know, in Asian communities, pro-whiteness is taught. You know, I was also getting messages from my mom, because I have two other siblings and we all came out differently. So my brother, no one ever thinks he's Filipino. He presents as a regular Black guy. And my sister looks totally mixed, but like Samoan. So nobody knows, we all represent very differently. And so I got messages about, my skin color. My mom would marvel at, oh, you look so mestiza, which is a good thing in the Philippines, I guess. And, that my hair was good. And so those are messages that I also had to unravel and untangle because, they were negative toward my sister and my brother. So these are things that are happening in my home, and then you're getting messages outside the home. So it's all around you. And as an adult, and as I went to college and started learning and seeking out because you do have to seek the information out. It's not just going to drop into your lap. You have to actively learn it. I got better. And so that's important for me because I'm also raising, mixed race children.
Right. You mentioned also that when you were thrust into the public spotlight, all of a sudden you were the biracial figure in America, right? What messages did you hear from the public at that time? Was it in a similar fashion or?
And that was another thing. I went on to MTV's The Real World, New Orleans in the year 2000, and talking about race and ethnicity and where a person fits in, those weren't normal conversations that you would see on a TV show. And also, I was put in there, where a lot of reality show participants who are people of color, who are Asian, who are LGBT, who are Black, they're usually put in these positions where they're kind of in a teacher role because the narrative of the show is how this white person will respond to all these others. And so we are sort of, we become kind of accidental teachers. And then by talking about our lived experiences, we become accidental activists. But in 2000, this was the rise of message boards, and, social media was kind of new. We were about to come into MySpace, and you could go onto a reality show and everybody could talk about your experience and how they perceived you and how they feel about you. And so because many of the episodes were me tackling, white people saying problematic things, I sort of became a villain in that, where I was correcting them. Whereas now, the conversation, thankfully, we have things like this, panels like this, where we can talk about it openly and safely and actually get a message across, where I was the person that was walking away from those conversations in tears. And then I would go online and have everybody be like, oh my God, Melissa is obsessed with race. And it wasn't that I was obsessed with race. It was that you asked me this question or you said this problematic thing and all I did was call it out. So that was interesting. But I will say in the 20 years since I have been on that show, I've gotten many messages from people over the years that, I was the first person that they saw that was biracial who had language that they wanted to use or who articulated these feelings that they had. So in that sense, it has been, rewarding to have been put in that position and given that opportunity.
That's really great. And I think that's something that we all can sort of take from that. We all have our sort of branded accounts through social media, right? And so as a result, we have a platform, right? And no matter how small or big that platform is, if we as AAPI and people of color or just even allies use that platform to spread messages like this, we can help educate, because for each person, you could be the first person to talk to them about that, right? I want to move to Deepa and Sanjit. I want to ask you about the model minority myth. What does that phrase mean to you? And how did that mentality sort of affect your views on the Black community, especially growing up? And then what caused you to evolve over time?
Just thinking about the idea of model minority myth, two things that have come up that have been talked about is when Deepa talked about the latter, and then Melissa was just talking about narrative. And I think that both of those things are essential for myths to actually perpetrate themselves. And so the model minority myth can't exist without the other myths, especially in American society, that are also happening at the same time. We are in conversation. That myth is in conversation with a bunch of other myths: the Black myth, the myth about Mexicans, the myth about any kind, you name it, indigenous people, whoever it is. And so for me, growing up, it's interesting. I thought a lot about this, and a moment when I was in third grade comes to mind. And I think before I talk about that, I think there's one thing to think about is that that ladder of white supremacy in my parents' origin country, the ladder is there. It might not be called white supremacy. It might be called Hindu supremacy. It might be called Brahminical supremacy. But it's some kind of supremacy where there is a stacked ladder of exceptionalism. And I think, thinking about this particular moment in my life in third grade, I think I was very much indicting what my parents' reaction was, in particular my mother, in this moment. But in reality, what was she carrying with her from her origin country is really, really super important to understand, to start the connection and the conversation, to not just indict someone for the feelings they might have. And what happened was I was very close friends with three people and that I played with on the playground, Rosalind, Yolanda, and Charles, all Black. And I lived in a small town in Ohio. And I asked my mom if they could come over to my house to play. And I remember going back to tell Yolanda, who's the one person I do remember from that moment, to say that, actually my mom said that I can't actually have, we didn't call it a play date at that time. It was the 80s. It was called, like, you can't come over to play. And Yolanda looked at me, and this is 42 years later. Yolanda looked at, and I still remember this moment. She looked at me and she said, "I know why I can't come to your house. It's because I'm Black, isn't it?" Mm-hmm. And I was silent. I don't think I responded to it because I felt so much shame in that moment. And I never discussed it with my mom. And I don't think I've discussed it with her to this day. And I'm not even sure she would remember. But I think what it was is less about, well, my mom was anti-Black in that moment. Of course she was. But what was happening in that circumstance to perpetrate that? You come over from a country and you are told you are this way. And then you are told in so many narratives that are floating around in the society that other people are other ways. And then on top of that, you are actually coming over with a certain level of entitlement and supremacy based on potentially your past. And so all of that is interacting together. And for me, not until now have I really, and really thinking on the questions you all posed, really kind of put together and been able to put language to it. So how have I dealt with the model minority myth? Some days I have totally played into it. When I was young, that was what we did. We became better then. That was what, anytime we got educated, we're highly educated. This is that. Those were the examples I was looking for. Was I looking for anything else? I'm not really sure. So, and then times, by the time I got to college, to go back to the conversation that everybody's talked about, I got that exposure that was really about what does this all sit in, and asking that question and dispelling some of that as we go along. But look, we've been conditioned. I'm not going to say I'm fully dispelled of it, that there are moments you have to stay aware. You have to catch yourself, and you have to stay aware as to how you're passing that on to the people around you, particularly youth that you're around, and how youth are activating that as well. And how do you catch that as an adult in your family and say, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Like, we're this and we're that, So that's kind of from my perspective.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. I have a little different story. I mean, I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and there was a civil war there for 30 years between the Sinhalese and the Tamil. My dad is Sinhalese, my mom is Tamil. And so we grew up sort of under they were a marriage that shouldn't have been together. And we fled the country, and we actually went to Africa. So we lived in Africa for a while, and we then came here. And I think it's really interesting for me now, looking back, how white supremacy is a system and not just about color. Because my mother, people thought she was African, right? Or are you from Africa? Are you Black? Or because he's very dark skinned, my dad is very light skinned. And it's interesting that when even though they had fled wars, and when we came in here, somehow because of the mainstream media and the news and the history we perceived, they still bought into the fact that Black people were actually lower, right? That Black people, they bought in this weird myths of like Black people are lazy, or can't pull themselves up, but yet they didn't feel the same way about Africans. My Jamaican friend. Right, so it wasn't necessarily about skin color, but this systemic idea of white supremacy is not just about skin color, but about systems that oppress you. So that, and for me personally, when I came here, it was you're either white or you're black, and I didn't see myself in there, and I gravitated towards black culture, towards hip hop, you know, and I feel like my parents kind of were like, they're like, you're not black, right? But in America, it felt like you had to kind of choose, right? And for me, black culture felt to me much more something I could relate to. And then in terms of the model minority myth, it's interesting. I was always told, like, you got to be twice as good as anyone else. That you have to be twice as good. And so I feel like I have a complicated relationship to the model minority myth, and also race and skin color and white supremacy in general, right? And I feel like only now, as I've gotten older, I've really understood the holistic understanding of the systemic racism in a way I never understood growing up. And to my parents' credit, my sister is now married to a black woman, and so they have grown so much. By the way, our family has grown. My mother is taking anti-racist classes, and they're talking about equity, inclusion, and they have all this new vocabulary, right? I can talk about white supremacy with my mother and my father. That's like blowing my mind. And I think what's interesting, Deepa said it's really important. It's true with this idea, also separating. For me, I felt a lot of racism towards being a South Asian in America. Like, what are you? And people thought I was Middle Eastern or Latino. So I was dealing with my own sense of prejudice here, right? And then and I've always felt, anti-Blackness in America. But when George Floyd really happened and the Black Lives Matter movement happened, it was the first time in my core felt like, until Black people are free in this country, none of us are free in this country. And until that, that was so, it just hit me so hard, that we that is a truth of this country that we have to deal with, and I think that's been important for me in my journey.
Yeah, one more thing I would add about the model minority myth is that not only origin countries from where people are coming from doesn't matter, but it's a structure within that, because as Rue well knows, our family is actually rooted in East Africa. So there's a different dynamic between Africans and Indians there, many of whom work together, many of them living in very segregated societies. And there was sort of a ladder there as well. So if you're coming over to this country and then you're coming from that ladder, and then another ladder is available to you and accessible, whereby you are higher up on the rungs, you are going to opt for that. Not because you just want to be better, because that's the only way you're going to survive. So I in no way defend anti-Blackness, but I do try to understand where that suffering comes from and why and what those origins are. And so parents like us actually really need to be able to articulate that history to our children, to understand that sits there, but there's not an indictment, but it's rooted in something. And then once people start to activate that, how you catch it, to Deepa's point about the practice being really difficult. It is very difficult even with children, because it's painful. It's painful for all of us. Whether we like it or not, whether we think we're better, it's still pain. Whether we recognize what that pain really is really important to actually confront and really accept as part of the process.
Thank you so much. Sujan, did you have additional thoughts on the model minority myth?
Yeah. Yes, I just want to point out that the model minority myth, as Deepa was pointing out, is like, it's painful to the Asian American community. Like, it harms Asian Americans, and in several ways. First, it denies the existence of racism against Asian people, and it denies the heterogeneity among the Asian American community. There are huge class differences. And then finally, the other thing that I would like to offer is that it erases the long history of Asian American activism and involvement in social justice movements. This idea that Asian Americans are apolitical, that they're quiet, submissive, subservient, and are like hands off like this to politics, it's flat out untrue. What the model minority myth works to do is it works to suppress our resistance and also the history of activism and resistance that Asian American activists have had a long history of doing. Not only here in the U.S., but also, I mean, think about all of the different amazing like decolonizing activists in all of Asia, right?
Right. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And I think that, for me, I certainly didn't find my voice to break free until it was law school. That's when I learned I had also just come out, right? And when I came out, I was forced to create relationships outside of my family, right? And I was having meaningful relationships with other marginalized people. And that's when it really hit me that now I have this voice and I can try and use it for the greater good. And that's what allowed me to have these difficult conversations with my parents, et cetera. But it took some time for me to get there. So I'm glad that we've really starting to lay the groundwork now to make it much easier for kids, right? So I do want to move on to talking about kids specifically now, right? Because that's the whole point of today's program. Research shows that by the time kids are toddlers, race is already shaping their perspectives and preferences. It's clear we need to start talking about this when they're young, right? Melissa, you mentioned that your kids are multiracial as well. When did you start talking to them about being of mixed race?
I have 3 daughters, all of whom, my husband is Jewish. He and I debate on, his where he stands on the scale of whiteness, because he also presents racially ambiguous in a way. Nobody ever thinks he's a white guy. Everybody thinks, he's some kind of Latino. So his own experience in the world is not where he's treated like a white guy because he doesn't look like one. So there's that layer, but you should know that I have 3 children. All of them, have a proximity to whiteness. And so I think if we want to start talking about how to talk to our kids about it, you should first talk to your spouse before the children get here on how you plan to discuss racism, how you plan to combat anti-Blackness, because, he and I had different ideas about how we wanted to talk to the children. And I was like, these are conversations we should have before we have children, because a lot of raising kids is having hard discussions in the situation as it presents itself. There's no redo. Something bad could happen on the playground and it could feel uncomfortable. And so as a parent, you just don't address it. Not addressing it is kind of no longer on the table, because we live in a world where they're seeing this for themselves without you. And you kind of have to be prepared as a parent to have these conversations. So I think it starts very early on in nonverbal ways. So books that include Black, Asian, LGBTQ. And a lot of times people think that that's too much, but it's really not, because they're going to get those messages without you either way. So it's important for you as the parent to set the standard and the foundation for how you want that message to be sent. So it's books and toys. I'm talking about every color Barbie. We're not just going to have the blonde Barbie. We're going to get the darkest Black Barbie, the one that's on the shelf that's for some reason either more expensive than the others or completely on sale. It's always that way. So we are going to have books about dim sum, books about Indian food, books about, soul food. Those books are always kind of, it's you got to read the stuff yourself first. But I think starting very early on, and so that they have a clear picture in their mind of what this should feel like. And also when I talked about when I was in 2nd grade, that feeling of otherness that I had, where I didn't know if it was wrong if I was Black. I never want my kids to be in a situation where they can see that happening to another child and their instinct is to let it slide. So because I'm very open about, these feelings and how they're bad, I also teach my children to listen to their bodies. Like when you see something and it feels weird or it feels gross, it is. And you should say something. So I have a very, unflexible policy of if you see something, you say something, because you never want to be that child that laughs off the racist joke. That's not okay. It's never okay.
Yeah, thank you. Deepa and Sanjit, how about you guys? How early did you start to talk to your son about racism and his identity as a South Asian child? And then more currently, how are you talking to him about the events of this year, Black Lives Matter, and even the insurrection?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying before, my sister's wife is African American, so he's grown up with Black cousins. So for him, that's the world. Like that is how it operates. So for him, it is there's he has grown up pro-Black and having Black cousins and feeling like that is just part of his world. Like that's just how he's growing up. So for us, because of our and it was hard getting to that point for my parents, but because we grew up that way, because he grew up that way, he's very versed in being able to understand what it is, not understand what to be Black, but to know how to talk and to grow up seeing that is just part of who his family is. And I think with me, because early on I grew up to civil wars, and when I was 5 and 7, we were around gunfire and hatred and prejudice, and that just was my life. I feel like I should be as truthful as possible with our children, and we talk to him about just about everything, and I feel like my parents did with me. Of course, they didn't have a choice; they had to explain what was happening. But I think we tried to be as open as possible. And during the Eric Garner, we took him to the protests.
Well, also with Eric Garner, we had to talk about making a decision as to whether to show him, because they were showing the narrative so much on television. And we decided we would show it to him once. And I said, you have to sit here and you have to watch this man was killed. And this is what happened. We watched it once, we talked about it. And it's not okay to see violence on Black bodies over and over again. But when you contextualize watching it, that you have to face this, there are children across this world that have seen so much death and starvation. It is okay to let our children see that and talk about it and say, this is life. Like, life is this. And I think even during the Sandy Hook killings, we had to make a real choice. He was in kindergarten and it was painful. We had to say, this person came in and shot these children and they died, and that you need to know this happened. And it was very painful to talk about, but I was like, this is a reality. So even I would say we've also, we're in New York City, we're in a school, he has a great school. We have been privileged in many ways. There's no doubt about it. We've gotten lotteries in many ways. There's no doubt about it. And us not being Black is part of that. There's no doubt about that. But in his schools, they do a lot of the education there. The way they approach learning and history has sometimes taught us. And so we take that and we accent that. But at the same time, Black History Month once again, I don't really approach it as a month. We are always talking about what it might be. We build community with people from all kinds of backgrounds. We bring them into our homes. We go into their homes. We invite, and I started a theater company of people of color because I needed that community. I could not be an all-white community in theater. It was not in my body. And so he knows that this is what it is, and this is how we operate. And so for many parents who sit in segregated neighborhoods, many Asian people live in many white neighborhoods, many Asian people live in Black neighborhoods, and many Asian people find neighborhoods where there's lots of other Asians. Depending on where you are, sort of should define how you go about the exposure and really getting people to talk to people. It's books and all of that are absolutely important, but it's not the same as what Melissa and Suji are talking about, just living it and being it and trying as much as you can to watch when we migrate towards that segregation, because it's so powerful to keep us separated. It goes back to the system keeping us separated, and you have to be very active in not being separated live. with people, interacting in community with people.
I think just wanted to hop on what Deepa was saying. Deepa P was saying about Deepa Purohit, my wife was saying about we were lucky that he went to a public school that taught the transatlantic slave trade, that taught history, not just as Black history, but that's American history. And parents can't just do it by themselves. They need schools, societies, culture to also help raise our children, right? And so, our educational system in this country needs to wrap itself around that. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not just the parents that it's the burden on. It's about a system that has to also help to tell the story, right? I've always thought Black History Month is American history, right? That is American history, and I can't wait to get to that point where that is just accepted, right? Just as Asian American history needs to be part of our history, right?
Yeah. Hopefully we can do our best to get it part of the curriculum everywhere early on. But in some ways, what both of you were saying is it's never too early, right? It's never too early to start talking to your kids about that. And sometimes I feel like that's just an excuse because parents don't want to have that conversation, right? So Sujin, I want to turn to you. How does one go about, approach raising an anti-racist child?
Well, I think it begins with making a commitment. So for me, it's a way of life, and there is no other approach to parenting.
Mm-hmm.
I feel this deeply to my core because I was adopted when I was 5 years old and was raised by a white family in a nearly all white community. The only other people of color in my town were other adoptees. That's how white it was. So that environment bred in me self-hatred and shame, the white supremacist culture all around me in my home, my school, my church taught me to hate myself. And hatred is the expertise of white people, as Malcolm X points out when he said, quote, "The white man is the greatest hate teacher that ever walked the earth," end quote. So teaching people to hate others for being different is the byproduct of white supremacy. It spoon feeds you racism, sexism, heterosexism. And in my consumption of these isms, I internalized this simple yet toxic message that I received from everyone around me, that I'm not enough. Not only that, I was told directly and indirectly that I will never be enough, no matter how hard I try, because I will never be white. So when I became a mother, I was bound and determined to curate conditions that were the complete opposite of the ones that I grew up in. I was bound and determined to raise a daughter who loved herself without question. And that training started in the womb. As you said, Rue, there's no, it's never early. It's never too early to do this, right? Mm-hmm. So I started that training in the womb. I read her poetry from Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez, essays from Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and James Baldwin. And when she entered the world, I made sure that everything around her affirmed and validated her beauty and brilliance, and that she would know her history. So I remember buying her finger puppets of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. So she knew at 3 years old about the Underground Railroad and how Black people cared about other people so much that they worked hard to free them. And I never bought a book or a doll that featured whiteness. But when people would gift her with books, I would literally take a crayon and make all the white children brown. and when my daughter got blonde Barbies for her birthday, I would take a marker and color the hair black and make the skin color brown. So yes, I was that parent. And as she got older, I would check in with her from time to time, asking her, do you love yourself? Do you think you're beautiful? She's 13 years old now, and the answers have always been yes. Thank the universe for that. This summer, during the uprising, we both wanted to learn more about policing. So she enrolled in an online class about the history of policing that was taught by the Chicago Freedom School and Assata's Daughters. And I did my own research on policing and abolition. And once a week, we talk about what we learned. And when we watch TV together, we analyze and critique the representation of Black and Brown people on the screen. And we talk about the problematic things that were said and done in a particular scene. The list goes on in terms of how I incorporate anti-racist parenting practices, because anti-racism is the lens through which we see everything. So it truly is a way of life for us at home.
I really love that. And it's so powerful. I appreciate that so much. So thank you. Deepa Iyer, now there's a lot of talk about Black History Month, right? And, you know, we want to honor Black History Month, but at the same time, it's understood that, it's not just a month, right? So how are you talking to your son about it? And how do you commemorate it, but still stay true to what you believe?
Yeah, well, there's been so much great information here. I just want to piggyback on it. I think it's important to recognize that we don't kind of just do something for a week or when there is a traumatic event that happens and then we let it go, right? So it's a daily practice to both, I think, intervene and disrupt our own biases, as well as really, I think what Sujin is talking about is developing a critical lens and a critical framework that our children might have that perhaps we didn't have when we were growing up, right? Because we consumed so much of the system's narratives. And so in many ways, what we do at home is to make sure that we're in conversation with our child about what is happening around the world. We're in conversation with perceptions and things that are going on in his public school classroom, and how Black children might be treated or brown children might be treated. And we talk about that. We also do a lot of, I'm one of those people who really believes that learning about history is so important because Black and brown histories are invisibilized or they're told for us by others. And so one of the things we're doing right now, which you could find on my Instagram if you're interested, is we're having a conversation about the marches in Selma, Alabama that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And it's actually the 56th anniversary of the Selma marches next weekend. So what we're doing is reading about the people who were involved through the Zinn Education Project, which is a tremendous resource that folks could utilize. And then we're actually talking about how people play different roles. Were they disruptors? Were they storytellers? Were they frontline responders? And how did they actually connect to the movement? So those are just some examples of how we can take resources that are out there, apply them to our own, lives and with our children. But again, really understanding that it has to be a daily practice at some level. It doesn't have to go deep all the time, right? But it just has to be something that we're committed to on a day-by-day basis.
Thank you so much. I actually did view that video that you posted earlier today on that, and it was so informative. We shared it on our Act to Change profile, but definitely highly recommend checking it out. It's like a 5 to 6 minute video, but really, really informative. The question I want to ask you as a group is, navigating this conversation with kids is difficult, right? As adults, we can speak our mind very easily, right? And understand that the person on the other side will kind of get what we're trying to say, maybe sometimes. But, many parents tell us that they don't want to discuss race or anything controversial with their kids because they won't understand. When you encounter other parents that tell you that, like, what do you tell them? And how do you tell them that this is wrong? Deepa Iyer, if you.
Sure. I'm sure others have lots to add to this. I think that, I think it's really hard for people these days to make that kind of statement, living in a country that has just gone through a white supremacist administration and seen the horrific violence against Black bodies. It's hard to find people who will say that, but I'm sure those people exist. And when I hear that, what I often hear is sort of, our children are too young to have the conversation is one thing I hear. And also race is is something that we need to talk about diversity instead of the system of racism. So I think it's important to just recognize if those are the two kinds of narratives folks are coming in with in their inclination to not talk about race. And then when you hear that, to kind of disrupt that narrative, right? One, it's never too early to talk about race, because especially if you have a child who is of a different racial background, right? You have to, just as Sujin said, make sure that that child feels valued, because then the messages are all going to be the other way around. So at least start talking about that child's race and what it means to be a person of color living in this country, right? And then secondly, if it's about, well, let's talk about diversity and how we're all equal. You know, I remember that my son was part of some sort of MLK Day celebration at his preschool, and the message was, well, those things were happening then, but now everything's okay because we're all, you know, everyone's so diverse in this classroom. And so that was a conversation I did have with the teacher to sort of say, you know, that's not true, first of all, right? And secondly, diversity is not the panacea to racism. What is the panacea? It is solidarity. It is dismantling the systems of racism and oppression. Those are the panaceas. The other words are important. Diversity, inclusion, and equity are important words and important concepts, but justice and solidarity have to be part of the way that we fight racism.
Thank you so much. Sanjit, do you want to share something?
Yeah, I wanted to say I was so happy to hear Deepa say what she's saying, because if someone asked me that question, this is the work I have to do, I would struggle to not lose my shit. Or I would not confront it in a compassionate way. And I think that's the work that I have to do as a parent, and with myself as a parent, meaning I'm not consistent with that either. I'm not saying I'm perfect and I always talk about race and really difficult issues. I don't. I sometimes avoid it. But when I see it in other people to say, well, we don't need to talk about this, I lose it. Mm-hmm. And that's the work that I need to do as a
that actually
and to actually engage in the conversation that Deepa's talking, in the way that Deepa's talking about it, to stay focused and breathe and really stay with the conversation. And I think this practice, whether it's with your child, whether it's with a community member, whether it's a family member, I think that is the difficult thing, to breathe and stay with it and really ask the questions to seek understanding. So I think maybe a good practice that I should practice is that, so why do you feel this way about it, and continue the conversation instead of coming in with like, there's a right way to do this. Why are you, my initial reaction to that would be.
Thank you. And, Melissa, do you have something to add?
Yes, and to piggyback on that, it's also important, we were talking about how they learn things at school. As a parent, you need to also pay attention to the things that they do learn at school, because you might have to then undo that lesson or add to that lesson. And as we know, Black History Month, the children are taught that, love sees no color. They're taught these things that feel very good and feel very nice, but are not true. And so, it's hard to be that parent that has to chime in and, add to the commentary and call the teacher and explain those things, because white fragility is real. But it has to be done. And as Deepa, top left corner, was saying, it's hard to stay present in that conversation, because it is a visceral reaction when you hear your child has been taught a wrong thing, or when a well-meaning white person says, well, I just think it's harmful to have that conversation. Mm. It's hard to not be dismissive. It's hard to not be angry. And, you also sometimes feel resentful that you have to be the bigger person and you have to be this teacher. But the more you talk about it and the more normalized the conversation becomes, the easier it is. And also, the less you feel attached to their hurt feelings. Mm. So when you say it's your life, when you say it's a lifestyle, when you say it's your everyday conversations, when you say there's no other way to live, it's really true. If it becomes a core part of who you are with your chest, it gets less hard every day.
Sujin, I think you had something to add too.
Yeah, I just want to say that sometimes I think, parents say that because they feel like they're not educated enough to have the conversation with their children. And so what I want to offer is this, that you don't have to be. You can learn together with your child. You don't have to wait and do all this homework and get educated on your own in order to have this conversation with your child. Have the conversation with your child, period. I didn't know about about abolition and the history of policing, as or like when my daughter, when she asked me these questions, I didn't know. And so that's what led to us, learning together. And so that kind of, when you do that, you are providing a model to your children, saying that first, it's okay that you don't know everything, right? That is a very good thing to come to terms with. And secondly, that lifelong learning is valuable and it's wonderful and it's something that you can do together. So just wanted to offer that up.
This is all really great. I wanted to turn the conversation to a place where you really can't lose your cool, right? What happens when your child is on a play date and their friend says something wrong? I think that's the tricky part, right? You're sort of the non-white parent, maybe, right? That's in the room, and you hear someone say something. Do you take that opportunity to educate, or do you just send them home? I think I'm not a parent, but I've seen it happen. And it's always like, oh, do I see something? And I think that's the tricky part that a lot of people, that's where they encounter it more sometimes. So I'd love to hear some ideas on maybe how you attack that in the past.
Well, I'm the queen of well, actually, in those situations. And I think a well, actually, with especially we're talking about with young children, and like every non-white parent, every parent who is a person of color, Black parent, Asian parent, what have you, has been in this situation where a white parent or a white child will say something that I don't know about that. I have learned that humor, top loading with humor, does really well with, what will ultimately become the correction. And I've also found that when you do make those, slight corrections and you do them out of, you are coming from a place of, love. You want this person to understand more about why they can't say that thing. I mean, trust me, my husband, bless his heart, we've been together for nearly 20 years. He would be a millionaire if he had $1 for every time I say, well, actually, you can't say that. But it's important because I have found that once you actually somebody and you temper the wrong thing they said with, a little bit of compassion, a little bit of empathy, and trying to see that their worldview is not yours. They don't have your lived experience. They also have had no reason to seek out this information that you find so fascinating and so interesting because you are a person of color navigating a white world. So it's when you impart that education on them, it really is like a little ripple effect. That white person then takes that piece of information, if they're not fragile, they then take that piece of information and they share it with their other people. And then the next time they find themselves in that situation, they're overjoyed to be like, well, actually. So it's important, but it's hard. We're not going to say it's not hard, but you got to do it every time. Like, it's not one of those things where you can go, I'm going to let this slide today. The days of letting it slide are kind of over.
No, that's right. If you see or hear something, you should say something, right?
Yes, so we're the MTA out here. See something, say something.
Biba Purohit.
Yeah, that actually is a great segue into something I was just thinking about as you were talking, Melissa, which is the silence. And so we have really had to do. I can't remember a time where I actually had to deal with that. I can't say I did a ton of play dates where I stuck around. But I do think that there's something that I thought about in the silence is something I would have to think about is my own conditioning, because I have been conditioned through my life to be silent in those moments, particularly in white majority communities where you have walked through as a teenager, as a young person, people saying things to you and you haven't said anything, there is something actually valid about acknowledging that the silence isn't because you're not being brave all the time. You do have to be brave to say something, but the silence is also a level of oppression that has been sort of conditioned into you. And that's something to actually examine within yourself, to say, am I silent here because it's conditioned, or am I silent because I'm scared, or am I silent because I don't know what to do? It could be all of those things. So in a way, Melissa's thing is absolutely right. You have to you kind of can't not say anything, but there are going to be times when you don't. So I just don't want to necessarily fault people who are feeling that feeling of like, I'm not sure what to do in this moment. I don't feel, to Sujin's point about like being armed with the language or the knowledge to figure out what to do in this situation. And why is that? And for us, from other communities of color, we have to look at why that is. Have we been silenced by our own community in saying that you are not supposed to say these things? And then within the community, I grew up in a white majority community, to then say, I don't have a voice here and there's not much I can actually say, so I'm going to be quiet. And Melissa, to her point about being on in the real world, is like, you were 4,000 years ahead of your time saying things in that moment, and that's why you were indicted for it, you know, in many moments. And so at that time, many of us were just keeping it shut. And I think there's something important about acknowledging and being conscious of that ourselves.
Thank you. Sujin, I think you wanted to share too.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a story. So my daughter, when she was around 7 years old, she was playing with a neighbor girl, and the neighbor girl, she's white, and she said to her, "Are you from Russia?" And I feel like, here's the thing. So as adults, I think it's very easy for us to step in when a child says something, because it takes a village, you know, and I'm of that mentality that, you know, this is my village. So it's part of my responsibility to educate all the children that I encounter. And so that I just asked her, you know, like, why do you say that? Like, what makes you think that she's Russian? And she said, oh, I don't know. And then I'm like, is it because you think that she's not from here? Because, you know, so obviously the child had no sense of like what a Russian looked like, but all she knew was that Russia was not the US, you know, it was outside of the US. And I said, so is it because you think that she's not from here? And she's like, yeah. And I said, you know, and then I said, you know, sweetie, just because she doesn't have the same skin color as you doesn't mean that she's not from here and that she's not from this country. And so, like, really simple, easy, you know, to kind of step in and to do that kind of education, and in a way that isn't combative, is in a way that isn't off-putting. It's just like I said, as a parent, you know, I am seeing this child as, you know, not necessarily her parent, but that as a adult, that it's part of my responsibility to educate her as I would educate my daughter if she said something problematic. And then the last thing I would like to share is, I will never forget Toy Darracott. So she's a poet, a Black poet. I'll never forget when at a reading, she talked about racism as child abuse. And any time that I'm in a situation where I'm like, oh, I don't know if I should say something or not because I'm uncomfortable or I'm afraid or whatever, I always remind myself of that comparison, because would I step in if I saw a child being abused? I absolutely would. And so that's exactly how we need to think about these situations in order to inspire us to act and to step in and to do the right thing.
Wow, that's so impactful. That's the first time I heard that, and it like hit me like a bullet. And that's something that I am definitely going to think about. And it's so right. Yeah, racism is child abuse. That's certainly, wow, that kind of threw me, but truly, it's very impactful. I want to be mindful of time. You know, we've gone a little bit over, but at the same time, the conversation was so great that I didn't want to knock things off. I really appreciate all of you joining us today. I also want to give a special thank you to Deepa Iyer, who helped us immensely with today's program and really challenged us to create something that's really impactful. Deepa, based on what you've heard today, what are some key takeaways that you want to give to our audience?
Thanks a lot, Rue. There are so many because everyone has been so rich and brilliant and vulnerable. But I'll share a few that I wrote down, some through lines. First, just to understand that it is a lifelong process to practice solidarity and confront anti-Blackness, but we need to just start, right? And I think something that Sujin said is so important, that we need to learn together, that we don't have to know everything. We don't have to be fully fledged, equity and justice warriors. So learning with our children, learning with our families, and also admitting when we don't know something. So want to lift that up. The second is just also recognizing how both we and our kids are consuming anti-Blackness. I really was struck with what Melissa said about even inside of her own home and in terms of looking at her siblings versus herself, right? So anti-Blackness and those narratives are everywhere, whether they are in our homes or outside. So how are we consuming them? How are our kids consuming them? And how do we intervene and disrupt? A third part is really about the importance of recognizing and dismantling those ladders that I talked about. And as Deepa, Prohit, and Sanjit talked about, it's important to recognize that those ladders aren't just about white supremacy, right? They could be about caste, they could be about color, they could be about class. And so they could be about what we come from our home countries and bring in. So how do we recognize when those ladders actually exist and we start to dismantle them and chip away with them? Another part is, I think, a fourth piece is the fighting the system, not each other, right? Because we're always going to be pitted against each other. And then I think two more things, really thinking about the different roles that we play. And, Sanjit talked about this in terms of even his own family and how it's shifted because of different people that are coming into the family. And so recognizing that sometimes we do have to be disruptors, but at other times we can be guides with our children, right? So we all have different roles that we can play in combating anti-Blackness. And then the final thing is, even as we challenge our family members, even as we have these courageous conversations with our people, let us also love our people. Let us celebrate our people. Let us not dispose of our grandparents and our parents and our uncles and aunties because they don't get it, right? Let's love. And I think that is really important because that too is a way in which we dismantle these ladders and actually make progress in terms of solidarity and justice.
Thank you so much for putting that together so well. I think that what today really shows me is you don't have to be the most educated activist to be in a position to teach youth about these issues, right? I'm not even a parent, and I'm excited to encounter all the kids in my life, and be part of the change I want to see in the world, right? So thank you all. I want to close out today with a witness round, which is an age-old practice with Indigenous roots that acknowledges everyone's presence today. In this witness round, everyone will say one word or phrase that they heard in today's conversation that resonates with them. Who wants to go first? I'll go first. The first one the one that really struck me was bound and determined. Sanjit?
The one word that stuck with me is womb.
One that stuck with me was ladder.
I would say brave.
Solidarity.
Oh, is it my turn? I have a phrase. Examine your silence.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This was really, really amazing. I'll have Elaine come on.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Oh, thank you so much. I've been backstage and just really appreciative of this conversation. I hope everyone watching today feels empowered to be a leader in your own way and continue to push forward as we remember that Black justice is our justice. I'm also here to remind you that your feedback is really important to us. So we will be sending a follow-up email to take our survey. I'm the person that reads your feedback. So again, please do fill out that survey. And we want to remind you that we have an upcoming event. On March 13th, we're hosting a bystander intervention training with Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Hollaback. So please follow our social media for more information in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This has been great. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. My heart is so full. Thank you.
Thank you.